Jonathan Caldwell sat in his office, a glass of bourbon in hand, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline. The golden light of the setting sun reflected off the towering skyscrapers, casting a warm glow over the city. From this vantage point, he had built his empire, every business deal, every acquisition, every move that made him one of the most powerful men in New York. And yet, despite all his success, a lingering sense of dissatisfaction gnawed at him. His upcoming wedding was supposed to be the final piece of his perfect life. Olivia Harrington was the ideal bride, poised, elegant, and most importantly, an asset. Marrying her would unite two of the wealthiest families in New York, creating an unstoppable dynasty. This wasn't about love. It was about power, control, and ensuring no one could ever challenge him. Jonathan's fingers traced the edge of the black invitation envelope resting on his desk. A smirk played on his lips. This wedding wasn't just about securing his future. It was about proving a point. A reminder to the one woman who had dared to walk away from him. Claire Bennett. Even after 8 years, her name still stirred something in his chest, something he refused to name. She had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and betrayal. He had told himself he had moved on, but the bitterness never faded. Now, he had the chance to show her just how much he had risen without her. "You're really going through with this?" Jonathan glanced up as his younger sister, Victoria Caldwell, sauntered into his office, holding a glass of wine. Impeccably dressed as always, her sleek ponytail and designer heels complemented her sharp gaze. "Yes," he replied smoothly, leaning back in his chair. Victoria studied him, a knowing smirk forming. "You do realize she won't come, right?" She disappeared, Jonathan. Poof. Gone like she never existed. "She'll come," he said, amusement lacing his voice. Claire never could resist proving a point. Victoria arched an eyebrow. "And what exactly is the point of this?" "Revenge." Jonathan swirled the bourbon in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. "Call it closure." Victoria laughed, shaking her head. "Closure? Please. You don't want closure. You want her to walk into that ballroom and see that you're untouchable now. You want her to regret leaving you." Jonathan didn't deny it. He had spent years rebuilding himself after Claire left, turning heartbreak into ambition. He had become wealthier, more powerful, and completely unshakable. And now, she would see it firsthand. "She'll see what she lost," he murmured, slipping the invitation into a stack of outgoing mail. Victoria watched him for a moment before smirking. "Well, if you want to rub your success in her face, I won't stop you. Just don't expect her to crawl back." Jonathan chuckled. "She won't, and I wouldn't want her to." But even as he said the words, something in his chest tightened. Claire Bennett wiped her hands on a dish towel, setting aside the last plate from dinner. The scent of freshly baked cookies lingered in the air, mixing with the soft hum of jazz playing from her old radio. It had been a peaceful evening, until the black envelope arrived. She froze in the doorway, the invitation clutched in her hands, her heart pounding. Jonathan Caldwell. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. His wedding. Exhaling slowly, she tried to steady herself. 8 years had passed since she had last seen him. 8 years since she had fled New York with nothing but a suitcase, and a secret she never got the chance to tell him. She had convinced herself it was for the best, that walking away had been her only option. But now, holding his name in her hands, the past rushed back, the late nights wrapped in his arms, the laughter, the love, and then the betrayal, the accusations, the words that shattered everything. "Mommy." Claire snapped out of her daze as 2 identical sets of brown eyes peered up at her. Ava and Emma, her 7-year-old daughters, stood in the doorway, their curious gazes shifting between her and the letter. "What's that?" Ava asked, pointing at the envelope. Claire hesitated before forcing a smile. "Just an invitation." "To what?" Emma pressed, tilting her head. Claire exhaled. She had spent years keeping their father a secret, unsure when or how to tell them the truth. But now, it seemed fate had made the decision for her. She knelt in front of them, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. "It's an invitation to a wedding." The girls exchanged glances before Ava frowned. "Are we going?" Claire bit her lip. She had vowed never to return to Jonathan's world. But could she really keep the truth from him forever? Maybe, she said softly. Ava's face lit up. Can we wear fancy dresses? Despite herself, Claire chuckled, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. We'll see. As the girls ran off giggling, Claire's smile faded. She turned the invitation over in her hands, her stomach twisting. Jonathan wasn't expecting this. He wasn't expecting them. Claire tightened her grip on the steering wheel as she drove through Manhattan. Her heart pounded harder with every mile. The city hadn't changed, but she had. She wasn't the naive woman who had once believed in fairy tales. Now she was a mother, a protector. And she was here for one reason only: to face the man who had unknowingly fathered her daughters. Ava and Emma sat in the back seat, their excited chatter filling the car. To them, this was an adventure. They had never been to New York before, and the enormous buildings fascinated them. Claire glanced at them in the rearview mirror, her heart aching. They had no idea what awaited them. "Mommy, are we going to see your friend?" Ava asked, swinging her legs. Claire hesitated. Something like that. Emma, always observant, tilted her head. "You seem nervous." Claire exhaled. "It's just been a long time since I've been here." As they neared the grand hotel listed on the invitation, Claire's nerves twisted. She had tried to tell Jonathan before, when she first found out she was pregnant. She had called. No answer. Left messages. No reply. Even written him a letter, pouring out her heart. Nothing. Eventually, she had accepted that Jonathan had erased her from his life. Now, as she pulled up in front of the extravagant venue, she realized there was no turning back. This was happening. Tomorrow, Jonathan Caldwell would find out the truth. Jonathan's voice was rising now, and he didn't care who heard. "Even a rumor about you being pregnant," he shouted. Standing just a few feet away, Victoria felt her stomach twist. This wasn't going the way she had planned. She expected Jonathan to humiliate Claire, to watch her squirm as he moved on. But Claire had flipped everything upside down. And if Jonathan kept digging for details, the truth, her truth, might come out. Patrick Reynolds, Jonathan's longtime attorney and former confidant, shifted uneasily beside her. He had been part of keeping Claire out of Jonathan's life. Back then, Victoria had convinced him that Claire was toxic, a distraction, someone who would drag Jonathan down. But now, watching his best friend's world crumble, guilt sat like lead in his stomach. Claire took a step forward, her voice controlled but filled with years of pain. "I called you, Jonathan. The day I found out. No answer. I left messages. No response." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "That's impossible. I would have." "I wrote you a letter," Claire interrupted, her voice steady, though a flicker of emotion slipped through. "A long letter. I explained everything. How scared I was. How I didn't know what to do. How I needed you. And I never heard back. So don't you dare stand here and act like I didn't try." Jonathan stared at her, his mind racing. He would have never ignored something like that. If Claire had reached out, he would have known, wouldn't he? His gaze snapped to Victoria. She stood unnaturally still, fingers gripping the stem of a champagne flute a little too tightly. Her expression was unreadable, but Jonathan knew his sister well enough to recognize when she was hiding something. His gut twisted. "Victoria," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Did you know about this?" Victoria blinked, feigning confusion. "What? Did you know that Claire tried to contact me?" She let out a forced laugh, shaking her head. "Jonathan, this is ridiculous. You really think she—" "Don't lie to me." Victoria's throat tightened. She was skilled at twisting situations to her advantage, but this was slipping out of her control. She had counted on Jonathan's fury being directed at Claire, not at her. Claire watched the exchange, her stomach nodding. Could it be possible? Had Victoria intercepted her calls? A voice broke the silence, and all heads turned toward Patrick. Jonathan froze. Patrick exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face before looking Jonathan directly in the eyes. "I intercepted the calls. The letters. Everything." The room fell into suffocating silence. Claire felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her. The betrayal she had felt all those years ago reignited like a fresh wound torn open. Jonathan's chest rose and fell with barely controlled fury. You did what? Patrick swallowed hard, glancing at Victoria. But she remained silent. He knew he was on his own now. Victoria convinced me it was for your own good, he admitted. She said Claire had abandoned you, that she was toxic, that it was best if you moved on. His voice was strained, full of regret. I believed her. Jonathan's fists clenched at his sides. He turned back to Claire, who looked just as shaken as he felt. She had tried. She had wanted to tell him, and he had been kept in the dark. His gaze flickered to Ava and Emma, his daughters, who were now watching him with careful eyes. He had lost 8 years with them. 8 years of first words, first steps, bedtime stories, scraped knees, birthday candles, all stolen. Victoria took a cautious step forward, her voice dripping with fake concern. Jonathan, please. You have to understand. Get out. His voice was sharp, void of emotion. Victoria's lips parted. What? Jonathan's eyes met hers, cold and unrelenting. Get out. For the first time in her life, Victoria had no words. She took a step back, mouth opening as if to argue, but the look on his face made it clear. He was done with her. Olivia, having watched the entire disaster unfold, finally found her voice. Jonathan, this is insane. Her tone was clipped, sharp. Her carefully curated future was crumbling. You're seriously going to throw everything away over this? She gestured toward Claire and the girls. Jonathan turned to Olivia for the first time since the confrontation began. He studied her carefully. The woman he had once convinced himself would be the perfect partner. The truth was glaringly obvious now. She had never really mattered. I'm sorry, Olivia, he said simply. That was all it took. She knew. The engagement, the wedding, the carefully structured life they had planned. It was over. Her face hardened, but she knew there was nothing left to say. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her expensive gown swaying with each sharp step. Jonathan finally turned back to Claire. Their eyes met. The anger had faded, replaced by something far heavier. Let's talk, he said, his voice quieter now. Claire nodded, and together they left the ballroom, stepping away from a night that was supposed to be about his future, only to be consumed by his past. Claire's voice trembled as she spoke. They don't even know you. Jonathan's expression remained cold. Then I guess I have a lot to make up for, he replied. And I will. I will fight for my place in their lives, whether you like it or not. Claire's nails dug into her palms. And what about what they want? She asked. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, just long enough for Clara to see the crack in his resolve. They don't know you, Jonathan, she continued, her voice gaining strength. They don't know the man standing in front of me right now. And if this is the man you want them to see, the one who threatens their mother and turns this into a war, then you're already losing. Jonathan clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that she was twisting everything. But deep down, he knew Clara's words had hit something inside him, something uncomfortable. He had spent years building himself into a man who never lost, who always came out on top. But this wasn't a business deal. This wasn't about power or revenge. This was about two little girls who had no idea he even existed. Clara saw the conflict in his eyes, but didn't let her guard down. You can demand a DNA test, she said, her tone softer but still firm. You can fight for legal rights, but none of that will change the fact that you don't know them. You don't know their favorite bedtime stories, what they dream about, or how they like their sandwiches cut. Jonathan swallowed hard. He hadn't considered any of that. They are not pawns in whatever battle you think we're having, Clara continued. So before you start throwing threats at me, ask yourself, what matters more, winning against me or actually being a father to them? Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Jonathan turned away, exhaling sharply as he braced himself against the table. He hated this, hated feeling out of control. Finally, after what felt like forever, he spoke. I still want the DNA test. Clara nodded, her voice unreadable. Fine. Jonathan turned back to her, his expression just as unreadable. But if they're mine. They are, she interrupted. He nodded slowly, processing what that meant. Then we figure this out. Clara's throat tightened. Okay. Clara sat alone in her hotel room after Jonathan left, staring out at the glowing city skyline. Her hands trembled as she pressed her fingers to her temples. She had told him part of the truth, but there was so much more he didn't know, so much she still couldn't bring herself to say. Because the night she left New York all those years ago, she hadn't left by choice. She had been forced to disappear. The memories came rushing back, uninvited and relentless. She had been 3 months pregnant when she first realized something was wrong. At first, she thought Jonathan was just too angry to listen, too caught up in the fallout of their breakup to care. But then, her calls went unanswered. First, it was Jonathan, his voicemail always full, his number ringing endlessly. Then, it was his office. The secretary who once greeted her warmly suddenly acted like she didn't exist. Emails were ignored, texts never delivered. And then came the men. She first noticed them while walking home one evening, clutching her coat around her growing belly. 2 men, dressed too sharply to be random strangers, lingered near her apartment. She told herself she was imagining things. She was exhausted, stressed beyond belief. But then she saw them again, outside the small cafe where she worked after losing access to Jonathan's accounts, following her taxi to a doctor's appointment, watching her building from across the street. One evening, she finally confronted one of them, a stocky man with sharp blue eyes, pretending to read a newspaper. "Who are you?" she demanded, her hands trembling despite her firm tone. The man simply smiled, folding the paper neatly before meeting her gaze. "Just doing my job, Miss Bennett." That's when she knew Jonathan had sent them. At first, she felt relief. It meant he still cared, right? That maybe he was just too stubborn to reach out himself. But then she understood. Jonathan wasn't trying to find her. He was making sure she stayed gone. The betrayal crushed her. She tried everything to reach him, going to his office, writing letters, pleading with his closest friend, Patrick Reynolds. But Patrick shut her down cold. "You need to leave, Clara," he told her. "Jonathan doesn't want to see you. He doesn't want anything to do with you." She refused to believe it, until she received the final blow. A letter, not from Jonathan, but from a lawyer. A warning. If she ever tried to contact Jonathan again, there would be legal consequences. That's when she finally accepted it. Jonathan had abandoned her. Jonathan sat across from the doctor, arms crossed tightly. The folder containing the DNA results lay on the table between them. "I have the results," the doctor said neutrally, sliding the envelope forward. Jonathan's fingers felt ice cold as he unfolded the paper. His heart pounded. He read the words slowly, as if doing so would somehow change them. 99.99% probability. Ava and Emma were his daughters. He had known deep down the moment he saw them, but seeing it in black and white made it undeniable. He had missed their first words, their first steps, their birthdays. He had missed everything. The air in the room felt suffocating. Jonathan slowly set the paper down, rubbing a hand over his face. He needed to see them. Clara heard the knock on her hotel room door and knew exactly who it was before she even opened it. Jonathan stood there, looking more tense than she had ever seen him. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something unfamiliar, something vulnerable. "I got the results," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Clara swallowed. She had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. "They're mine," he said. She nodded. "Yes." Jonathan stepped inside, his eyes immediately landing on the 2 small figures sleeping in the bed. His daughters. He took a hesitant step forward. "They don't even know who I am," he muttered. "No, they don't," Clara said simply. He turned to her. "I want to fix that." She sighed, leaning against the dresser. "Jonathan, this isn't something you can fix overnight. You can't just show up and expect them to accept you." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "I don't expect anything, but I'm not going to disappear." Before Clara could respond, another knock at the door interrupted them. She opened it, and her stomach sank. "Olivia." The tension in the room skyrocketed. "So this is what it was all about." Olivia's voice was sharp. "You wanted to ruin my wedding, so you could worm your way back into his life." Clara frowned. I didn't come here for Jonathan. I came for my children. And yet here you are, Olivia said bitterly. Jonathan sighed. Olivia, not now. But Olivia wasn't listening. She turned to Clara, her expression unreadable. You win. Clara shook her head. This isn't a game. Maybe not for you, Olivia whispered, but for me it always was. And then she walked away, slamming the door behind her. Jonathan exhaled, rubbing his face. That could have gone better. Clara looked at him. Jonathan. He cut her off, his voice softer this time. I don't regret her leaving. Claire's heart skipped a beat as Jonathan met her gaze. I don't know what this means for us, but I know I need to be in my daughter's lives, and I need you to let me. She hesitated, emotions warring inside her. For the first time since this all started, she wasn't sure what to do. Jonathan stood near the playground, watching Ava and Emma on the swings, their small legs kicking at the air. Their laughter should have been the sweetest sound in the world to him, but instead, it felt distant, like something he wasn't a part of. They barely acknowledged his presence. Claire sat on the park bench beside him, arms crossed, watching them carefully. She hadn't said much since they arrived, which only made Jonathan more restless. He had expected this to be difficult, but seeing his own daughters treat him like a stranger was something he hadn't fully prepared for. How long are you going to stand there? Claire finally asked, glancing at him. Jonathan exhaled slowly. I don't know what to say to them. She turned to face him. Try starting with hello. He shot her a look, but she wasn't wrong. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, hesitating before crouching beside the swings where Ava sat. Emma stood next to her, watching warily. Hey, Jonathan said softly. Ava didn't respond. She just kept swinging. Emma narrowed her eyes slightly, but didn't move away. Jonathan cleared his throat, feeling absurdly awkward. He had closed billion-dollar deals and stood in boardrooms full of ruthless executives, yet he had never felt this nervous. But this, trying to talk to his own daughters, was terrifying. Aya, he ran a hand through his hair. I know this is weird. For you. For me. But I want to get to know you both. Ava finally slowed down her swing and looked at him. Why? Jonathan blinked. Because you're my daughters. Ava's tiny shoulders stiffened. That's what Mommy says. Jonathan's throat tightened. She's right. Emma finally spoke, her voice quieter but firm. Then why weren't you here before? Jonathan felt that question like a slap to the face. He glanced at Claire, who was watching with unreadable eyes, waiting to see how he would handle it. He turned back to the girls. Because I didn't know about you, he admitted. And I wish I had. Ava frowned, studying him. You didn't know. Jonathan shook his head. No, I should have. I should have been there. But I didn't know. Emma crossed her arms. That doesn't make sense. Jonathan sighed. I know it doesn't. And I know it's going to take time for you to believe me. But I do want to be here now, if you'll let me. Ava looked at Emma, then back at Jonathan. We don't know you. Jonathan nodded. I know. But maybe we can change that. Ava hesitated before hopping off the swing. Maybe. Emma stayed where she was, her expression guarded. Maybe, she echoed. But it wasn't a promise. Jonathan straightened, watching them run back toward Claire. He exhaled, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. Claire met his eyes as the girls reached her, staying close. That's a start, she murmured. Jonathan sighed. It doesn't feel like one. She tilted her head. What were you expecting? That they'd run into your arms and call you Dad? Jonathan let out a humorless laugh. Honestly, I don't know what I expected. Claire studied him for a moment. They're not going to trust you overnight, Jonathan. His jaw clenched. I know that. Do you? She challenged. Because right now, you look like a man who's used to getting everything he wants the moment he wants it. Jonathan shot her a look. That's not fair. Claire sighed, watching their daughters play in the distance. It's the truth. Jonathan ran a hand down his face. So what do I do? Claire turned to him fully, her expression softer but still firm. You show up. Every time. No matter how frustrating it is. No matter how much they push you away. You prove to them that you're not just another person who's going to disappear. Jonathan swallowed hard. And you? Do I have to prove it to you too? Claire hesitated, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her expression. You don't have to prove you love them, she finally said. But you have to prove that you can be consistent. That you're not just here because of guilt or obligation. Jonathan exhaled. I don't do guilt, Claire. She gave him a small, knowing smile. You do now. They stood in silence for a moment, watching Ava and Emma run toward a group of kids playing tag. Jonathan's heart ached as he watched them, realizing just how much of their lives he had missed. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for the future. That night, Jonathan arrived at the hotel again. He had spent the day thinking, strategizing the way he always did in business. But this wasn't business. This was his daughter's. When Claire opened the door, she looked surprised to see him. Jonathan, I want to read them a bedtime story, he said before he could second-guess himself. Claire's eyebrows lifted. You do? Jonathan nodded. I don't know if they'll let me, but I want to try. Claire studied him for a long moment before stepping aside. Inside, Ava and Emma were sitting on the bed, already in their pajamas. They looked up as Jonathan entered, their expressions cautious. He cleared his throat. Hey, girls. I was wondering if maybe I could read you a story tonight. Ava glanced at Emma, who frowned but didn't say no. Jonathan hesitated. I don't know which ones you like, but I can read anything you want. Emma reached for a book on the nightstand and held it out. Jonathan took it carefully, glancing at the title. The Little Prince. A lump formed in his throat. He had read this book as a child, sitting on his father's lap. Ava scooted over slightly, making just enough room for him to sit at the edge of the bed. He took a slow breath and started reading, his voice steady. As he read, he saw their expressions soften just a little. Claire watched from the doorway, arms crossed. But this time, she wasn't putting up a wall. Jonathan turned the page, his voice quieter now. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for now, something was enough. Jonathan's breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling unevenly. But the fury inside him was ice cold. He stormed up the front steps, barely pausing before slamming his fist against the door. Within seconds, Patrick opened it, his face tense, as if he'd been expecting this. We need to talk, Jonathan growled. Patrick hesitated for a brief moment before stepping aside, reluctantly letting him in. The townhouse was spotless, almost sterile, the kind of place that screamed wealth, but lacked warmth. It suited Patrick perfectly. Jonathan paced in the living room, his jaw clenched. You have 5 seconds to start talking. Patrick sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Jonathan. He exhaled deeply and walked toward the bar cart in the corner, pouring himself a drink. His hands trembled slightly. He didn't offer one to Jonathan. He knew better. I should have told you sooner, Patrick muttered. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Told me what? That you and my sister spent years manipulating me? That you let me believe Claire abandoned me when you knew she was trying to reach me? Patrick closed his eyes briefly. I thought I was protecting you. Jonathan let out a cold, hollow laugh. Protecting me? He took a step closer. From what exactly? The woman I loved? The mother of my children? Patrick swallowed hard. Victoria convinced me she was using you. That she was trying to trap you with the pregnancy. That she wasn't good for you. He looked away. I believed her. Jonathan's blood boiled. You believed her. And that was enough for you to ruin my life? To take away my family? Patrick's shoulders slumped. Victoria made it seem like you would thank her one day. That Claire leaving was the best thing that could have happened to you. He hesitated. And when Claire didn't leave on her own, Victoria made sure she had no choice. Jonathan felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. What the hell does that mean? Patrick hesitated. What does that mean, Patrick? Patrick exhaled sharply. Victoria had people watching her. She made sure Claire couldn't get to you. She blocked her from your office, told security to turn her away. And when Claire still wouldn't give up, Victoria escalated things. Jonathan's pulse roared in his ears. Explain. Patrick hesitated before finally admitting. Victoria had her followed. She made it clear that if Claire didn't leave New York, she wouldn't be safe. Jonathan felt the air leave his lungs. His sister hadn't just kept Claire away. She had threatened her. He took a slow step back, his hands shaking. So you're telling me that while I was drowning myself in work, trying to move on, trying to convince myself that Claire had left me, she was out there terrified for her life? Patrick's silence was answer enough. Jonathan's hands balled into fists. And you let this happen? Patrick's jaw tightened. I regret it, Jonathan. I do. But at the time I thought. You thought what? That I'd be better off. Jonathan's voice was dangerously low. You stole 8 years from me, Patrick. Patrick sighed. You think I don't know that? You think I haven't lived with that guilt? He set his glass down roughly. Victoria controlled everything, Jonathan. Your business, your relationships, even your damn memories. Jonathan clenched his jaw, his mind racing. What else? Patrick hesitated again. Jonathan took another step forward, his voice sharp. What else did she do? Patrick exhaled. She intercepted the letters, the calls, all of it. But there's something else, something I didn't know until recently. He pulled a small key from his pocket and walked to a cabinet against the wall. He unlocked a drawer, pulled out a file, and handed it to Jonathan. Jonathan flipped it open, his stomach twisting as he scanned the contents. Bank statements. Claire's. His brows furrowed. What is this? Patrick hesitated. Victoria made sure Claire wouldn't have a way to support herself here. She had her fired from her job. Jonathan's head snapped up. What? Patrick nodded grimly. Claire had a decent job after you two split. It wasn't much, but it was enough to survive. Then suddenly, she was fired. No explanation, no references. No one in the industry would touch her. He hesitated. Victoria made sure of it. Jonathan felt sick. His sister had done everything to erase Claire from his life, from his world, and he had let it happen. He closed the file, his hands trembling. You helped her do this. Patrick looked away. I didn't know how far she had gone. I swear, Jonathan, if I had. Jonathan cut him off. But you knew enough. Patrick sighed. I did. Jonathan stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. We're done. Patrick frowned. Jonathan, you don't exist to me anymore. Jonathan's voice was eerily calm. I don't care what excuses you have or how guilty you feel. You are my best friend, and you helped ruin my life. Patrick's face fell. Jonathan, please. Get out of my sight. Patrick hesitated before nodding slowly. I really am sorry. Jonathan didn't reply. He just turned and walked out, leaving Patrick alone with the weight of his own guilt. Jonathan had never expected an invitation inside, yet here he was. Claire had let him in, not for herself, but for the girls. The backyard was small but cozy, enclosed by a white picket fence with a few trees swaying in the afternoon breeze. Ava and Emma sat on a blanket, crayons and coloring books spread out between them. Seeing them like that made something tighten in Jonathan's chest. Hey, girls, he said, crouching down beside them. Ava looked up first and gave him a shy smile. Hi. Emma, as usual, was more hesitant. She had started to warm up to him over the past few weeks, but she was cautious, watchful in a way that reminded him too much of Claire. Jonathan tapped the edge of a coloring book. What are we working on today? Princesses, Ava said, holding up her drawing. This one's mine. Jonathan smiled as he looked at the page. That's amazing. You're really good at this. Ava beamed. Mom says I should practice more if I want to get better. He glanced at Emma, who still held her crayon but hadn't spoken. He didn't push. He had learned that with Emma, patience was key. Instead, he sat cross-legged beside them and picked up a blank page. Mind if I join? Ava nodded eagerly, handing him a crayon. Emma said nothing but didn't object. As Jonathan focused on the paper in front of him, he realized how foreign this kind of moment was. He had spent his life in boardrooms, closing deals, making decisions that impacted thousands of people. But sitting here, coloring with two little girls who barely knew him, this was the hardest thing he had ever done, and the most important.